Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but when you're the secret they're planning to bury, everything changes. My parents always kept a blue folder in their bedroom desk drawer. As a kid, I assumed it was boring adult stuff, taxes, insurance papers, the kind of documents that made grown-ups sigh and rub their temples. I never had a reason to look inside until the day I thought they were going to die. I'm Alex, 23, their only child. My parents, David and Margaret, are the kind of people who plan everything. They have emergency kits in both cars, color-coded calendars on the kitchen wall, and backup plans for their backup plans. Growing up, I used to joke that they probably had a contingency strategy for what to do if the grocery store ran out of their preferred brand of cereal. It wasn't until much later that I realized how right I was, and how wrong I was about what those plans actually included. The crisis started on a Tuesday in October. I was living in my apartment across town, working my first real job out of college, when I got the call that every adult child dreads. My dad's voice was shaky, unfamiliar. "Alex, your mother's in the hospital. You need to come now." Mom had collapsed at work, a sudden, massive heart attack at 51. The doctor said it was a miracle she'd survived the first hour. As I sat in that sterile waiting room watching my father pace back and forth like a caged animal, I realized how unprepared I was for the possibility of losing them. They'd always seemed invincible, these two people who'd raised me with such methodical care, such deliberate attention to every detail of my life. For 3 days we lived in limbo. Mom was in the ICU, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Dad barely left her side, subsisting on hospital coffee and the sandwiches I brought him. We took turns holding her hand, talking to her unconscious form, pretending we weren't both terrified that she might never wake up. On the 4th day, while Dad was meeting with the cardiac surgeon, I drove to their house to pick up some things Mom would need when she woke up, because she was going to wake up, I told myself. I needed her favorite slippers, the book she'd been reading, the small framed photo of the three of us from last Christmas. That's when I noticed the desk drawer was slightly open. I don't know what made me look inside. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was the desperate need to feel connected to the life my parents had built, the life that suddenly seemed so fragile. The blue folder was right there, thicker than I'd remembered, with emergency protocols written in my father's careful handwriting across the tab. I almost didn't open it. Even in my emotional state, I knew I was crossing a line. But something about the weight of it, the way it felt substantial and important in my hands, made me slide my finger under the cover. The first few pages were what I'd expected. Copies of insurance policies, medical directives, contact information for lawyers and accountants. But as I flipped deeper, I found something that made my blood run cold. A detailed financial plan titled Post-Transition Restructuring. The language was clinical, almost business-like, but the content was unmistakable. It outlined how my parents would liquidate their assets, sell the house, and relocate to a smaller city in Arizona. There were specific timelines, budget projections, even research on climate and healthcare facilities in their target area. At first, I thought it was a retirement plan. My parents were in their early 50s. Maybe they were just planning ahead for their golden years. But then I saw the timeline. The plan was designed to be implemented within 12 to 18 months of Alex's transition to independent living. Independent living. As if I were a patient being discharged from a facility. I kept reading, my hands trembling slightly. The plan was incredibly detailed. They'd calculated exactly how much money they'd need to maintain their current lifestyle in Arizona. They'd researched neighborhoods, school districts for potential grandchildren they might never have, cost of living adjustments. They'd even identified a real estate agent and gotten preliminary quotes on selling the house. But the most devastating part was a section called Communication Strategy. It outlined how they would gradually reduce contact with their previous life to facilitate emotional adjustment to the new phase. There were specific recommendations about limiting phone calls, spacing out visits, and creating natural distance that would make the transition less traumatic for all parties. All parties. As if I were a business partner they were dissolving a contract with. I found myself sitting on their bedroom floor, surrounded by the scattered contents of their secret life. A life that had been planned with the same meticulous attention they'd given to raising me, except this time, the plan was specifically designed to not include me. The folder contained printouts of houses they'd looked at online, research on golf courses and retirement communities, even a list of local organizations they could join to establish new social connections. They'd thought of everything except how to tell their only child that they were planning to disappear. But the worst discovery was still to come. Tucked into the back of the folder was a handwritten letter, addressed to no one, in my mother's careful script. It was dated 6 months earlier, right around the time I'd graduated college and started my job. The letter began, "David and I have been talking about what comes next. Alex is finally launched, successful job, apartment, social life. We've done our job as parents, and now we have to figure out how to be just David and Margaret again." I had to stop reading. The word launched hit me like a physical blow. As if I were a rocket they'd been building for 23 years, and now that I'd successfully left the launch pad, they could finally shut down mission control and go home. But I kept reading because I had to know. We love Alex more than anything, the letter continued, but we also recognize that our relationship needs to evolve. We can't be the parents of a child anymore, we need to be the parents of an adult. And that means giving Alex space to build a life without us constantly looking over their shoulder. On the surface it sounded reasonable. Healthy even. But the more I read, the more I understood what they really meant. The house feels so empty now. Every room reminds us of who Alex used to be, not who they are now. We find ourselves waiting for phone calls that come less frequently, planning our weekends around visits that happen less often. We're living in the past and it's not fair to any of us. They weren't just planning to move. They were planning to grieve the end of active parenting as if I had died. Arizona would be a fresh start, the letter continued. No memories of bedtime stories or homework battles or high school graduation. We could build a life that's about us, not about the family we used to be. The family we used to be. Past tense. As if the moment I'd moved out, we'd stop being a family and become three separate individuals who happened to share some DNA and a few decades of shared history. I was still sitting on the floor when I heard my dad's car in the driveway. I scrambled to put everything back in the folder, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped half the papers. As I gathered them up, I caught sight of one more document that made my heart stop. It was a bank statement for an account I'd never seen before. D&M Transition Fund, with a balance of over $40,000. They'd been saving money for their escape plan. Money that could have helped me with student loans or a down payment on a house, or any of the other financial challenges that come with starting adult life. Instead, they'd been hoarding it, planning for the day they could finally be free of me. I managed to get the folder back together and the drawer closed just as I heard Dad's key in the front door. When he found me in the bedroom, I was holding Mom's slippers, trying to look like I'd just been gathering her things. "How is she?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "Better," he said, and for the first time in days he smiled. "She's awake. She's asking for you." I should have been relieved. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I felt like I was drowning in the knowledge that while my mother was fighting for her life, my parents had been planning their exit from mine. The drive back to the hospital felt endless. I kept replaying phrases from the letter, trying to recontextualize my entire relationship with my parents. Had they been counting down the days until I graduated? Had they been secretly relieved when I moved out? Had every family dinner, every phone call, every "how was your day?" been an obligation they were fulfilling until they could finally be free? When I walked into Mom's hospital room and saw her awake, her face lighting up when she saw me, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. This woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and celebrated every small victory in my life, she was planning to disappear. "Alex," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "I was so scared I wouldn't get to see you again." I took her hand, but it felt like I was acting in a play where I didn't know my lines. "I'm here, Mom," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." The irony of those words would haunt me for weeks. Over the next few days, as Mom recovered and the immediate crisis passed, I watched my parents with new eyes. I saw how they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching, not just as worried spouses but as co-conspirators who shared a secret I wasn't supposed to know. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because this next part changes everything. I started testing them in small ways. I mentioned how much I loved coming home for dinner on Sundays, how grateful I was to have them so close by. I talked about my future plans, the kind of life I wanted to build, how I hoped to raise my own kids someday with the same love and attention they'd given me. They smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but I could see the discomfort in their eyes. Every expression of closeness, every indication that I still saw them as central to my life, seemed to make them more anxious. A week after Mom came home from the hospital, I was having dinner with them when Dad brought up the subject I'd been dreading. "Alex," he said carefully, "your mother and I have been talking about some changes we want to make. Nothing dramatic, just some adjustments to how we're living." Mom was pushing food around her plate, not making eye contact. "We're thinking about downsizing," she said. "The house is too big for just the two of us now." I played dumb. "Downsizing? Like to a smaller place in the same area?" They exchanged a look that I now recognized as panic. "Well," Dad said slowly, "we've been looking at some options. Maybe a change of scenery would be good for us." "What kind of change of scenery?" Another look. Mom cleared her throat. "We've been researching some retirement communities. Not to retire yet, obviously, but to plan ahead. Some of them are in warmer climates." "How much warmer?" "Arizona," Dad said finally. "There are some beautiful places in Arizona." I sat back in my chair, pretending to consider this information for the first time. "Arizona. That's pretty far." "It's not that far," Mom said quickly. "Just a few hours by plane. And you could visit whenever you wanted." But I could see the truth in their faces. They didn't want me to visit whenever I wanted. They wanted me to visit rarely enough that they could build their new life without constantly being reminded of their old one. "When are you thinking about making this move?" I asked. "Oh, not for a while," Dad said. "Maybe next year. Or the year after. When you're more settled." Settled. Another euphemism for, when we're sure you don't need us anymore. That night, I went home and sat in my apartment staring at the walls. I thought about all the times my parents had told me they were proud of me, that they loved me, that family was the most important thing in the world. I thought about the bedtime stories and the birthday parties and the graduation celebrations. I thought about how they'd always said we were in this together, that we were a team. But teams don't plan to dissolve themselves the moment they achieve their objectives. I realized that everything I'd believed about my relationship with my parents had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding. I thought we were a family, a permanent bond that would evolve and change but never break. They'd thought we were a project with a completion date. The confrontation happened 2 weeks later. I couldn't stand it anymore. The pretending, the small talk, the careful way they were trying to manage my expectations without actually telling me the truth. I went to their house on a Saturday morning, when I knew they'd be having coffee and reading the newspaper in the kitchen. I brought the blue folder with me. "We need to talk," I said, placing the folder on the kitchen table. The color drained from both their faces. "Alex," Dad started, but I held up my hand. "I found this when I was getting Mom's things from the hospital. I've read all of it. The financial plans, the house listings, the timeline. I know about the transition fund. I know about Arizona." Mom started crying immediately. Dad looked like he was going to be sick. "I know you've been planning this for months," I continued. "I know you think I'm launched, and that your job is done. I know you want to build a life without me in it." "That's not," Mom began, but I cut her off. "Mom, I read your letter. The one where you talked about how the house reminds you of who I used to be, not who I am now. The one where you said you need to stop being the parents of a child and figure out how to be just David and Margaret again." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Dad spoke. "Alex, you have to understand. We love you more than anything. But we also need to figure out how to live our own lives. We've been parents for 23 years. We don't know how to be anything else. So you decided to run away?" "We're not running away," Mom said, wiping her eyes. "We're trying to give you space to grow up. And trying to give ourselves space to remember who we were before we became parents." "But I don't want space," I said, my voice breaking. "I want a family. I thought we were a family." "We are a family," Dad said. "But families change. They have to change. Do they have to disappear?" The question hung in the air between us. I could see them struggling with it, trying to find a way to explain their logic that didn't make them sound like they were abandoning me. "We weren't going to disappear," Mom said finally. "We were going to stay in touch. Visit. Have you visit us. According to your communication strategy, you were going to gradually reduce contact to make the transition less traumatic. You were planning to manage me out of your lives like I was an employee you didn't want to fire directly." They couldn't argue with that because it was exactly what they'd been planning. "What I don't understand," I said, "is why you couldn't just talk to me about this. Why you had to make it a secret plan. Why you had to make me feel like I was still part of your lives while you were planning your exit." "Because we didn't know how to talk about it," Dad said. "How do you tell your child that you need them to need you less?" "You start with honesty," I said. "You start with the assumption that I'm an adult who can handle difficult conversations. You start with the assumption that I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness looks different than I expected. Subscribe if you think you would have done the same thing, because I'm not sure I did the right thing." What I did next was probably not what they expected. I didn't yell or storm out or demand that they cancel their plans. Instead, I sat down at their kitchen table and said, "Okay, let's talk about Arizona." They looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "If you want to move to Arizona, let's figure out how to make that work for all of us. But let's do it honestly, as a family making a decision together, not as parents trying to manage their child's feelings." "What do you mean?" Mom asked. "I mean, show me the houses you've been looking at. Tell me what you love about Arizona. Let me help you figure out the logistics. Let me be part of the decision instead of just a problem you're trying to solve." "You want to help us move away from you?" Dad asked, confused. "I want to help you be happy," I said. "And I want to figure out how we can still be a family even if we're not living in the same city." The conversation that followed was one of the hardest of my life, but also one of the most important. We talked about their fears, that I would always see them as the parents of a child rather than as individuals with their own dreams and needs. We talked about my fears, that moving away meant they were rejecting me, that their new life would have no room for the messy, complicated reality of adult relationships. We talked about the money they'd saved, and how it felt like they'd been planning their escape while I was struggling with student loans and entry-level wages. We talked about the timeline and how it felt like they'd been counting down the days until they could be free of me. But we also talked about possibilities. About what it would mean to have a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. About how they could build a life in Arizona that included me, not as a reminder of their past but as part of their future. It wasn't a perfect conversation. There were tears and raised voices and moments when I wasn't sure we'd ever be able to move past the betrayal I felt. But it was honest in a way our relationship had never been before. In the end, they did move to Arizona. But not according to their secret plan. Instead, we spent 6 months working together to figure out how to make the transition work for all of us. I helped them research neighborhoods and flew out to look at houses with them. We established expectations for visits and phone calls and holidays. We figured out how to maintain our relationship while also allowing it to evolve. Most importantly, we learned how to be honest with each other about our needs and fears, instead of making assumptions about what the other person wanted or could handle. It's been 2 years since they moved. I visit them 4 times a year and they come back here twice a year. We talk on the phone every Sunday. It's different than it was when I was growing up, but it's not less. It's just different. The blue folder still exists, but now it contains information about all of us. Contact information for their Arizona doctors, but also details about my job and apartment. Emergency protocols that include me instead of planning around me. A family that's learned how to grow without disappearing. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that folder. Would they have gone through with their plan? Would they have gradually faded out of my life, moving to Arizona and slowly reducing contact until we were just holiday cards and birthday phone calls? I think they would have. Not because they didn't love me, but because they didn't know how to love me differently. They didn't know how to transition from being the parents of a child to being the parents of an adult without losing themselves in the process. The folder taught me that love isn't always enough. Sometimes you also need courage. The courage to have difficult conversations, to admit when you're scared, to ask for what you need instead of just taking what you think you deserve. And sometimes, you need the courage to let the people you love change, even when that change feels like loss.